Next, we need to talk about how do you go about making your argument strong. And if we think about argumentation as a skill, we need to think about ways to approach it. And there are three argumentative appeals, or three ways that we can try to convince somebody that what we're saying is accurate. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, logical reasoning, facts, statistics, etc., is only one part of convincing people that what we say is accurate. And in fact, the other two types of appeals sometimes have more influence than we would like to admit. So we need to think about what exactly are these ways to try to convince somebody to believe what we say. And you probably have heard of these before at some point, and even if you haven't in these terms, the concept should be somewhat familiar. Now, the argumentative appeals are such an ancient idea that they were originally come up with by a guy in a toga, Aristotle. Maybe you've heard of him. And he said, as I mentioned, that there are three ways that you can go about appealing to your reader. Okay, any idea of what these are? Like I said, you might have heard of these before, at least in the title of this video. Ethos, Pathos, and Logos. Okay, now these are Greek terms, but these are things that still have a huge bearing in our modern day discourse. Okay, so we're going to go through what exactly these are, some examples of them, and then you're going to actually be doing a few detailed activities where you look for these in other people's writings so that you can get a better understanding of how to use them in your own. Okay. Now first, ethos. Any idea what this one means? Okay, well, ethos is credibility. Okay, credibility meaning somebody trusts you. Okay, what is it about the speaker or the writer, depending on the medium of communication, that gets people to listen to what they have to say? Okay, now keep in mind, this is beyond logic. This has nothing to do with if what they say is actually true, but rather it's an issue, are they credible? Another word for this is believability. Okay? For instance, you're all listening to this video and paying attention to what I say and probably accepting it as true. Now, it's possible that I'm making this all up, but think about, why do you think I have credibility? Why do you listen to what I say? Well, I'm teaching this course, and the college puts us through a vetting process. They only hire people with degrees and the proper credentials, similar to if you go to a doctor. He or she tells you something to do for your health, and you don't get proof that that's true. You don't look up in a medical book to see if the prognosis is correct. At least most of us don't. And think about why. But once again, if somebody's operating as a doctor, they have gone through the process of medical school, they have a diploma, they have gone through state board tests to prove that they know what they're doing, they have not been sued for malpractice, hopefully. So all these things are not logical reasons to agree with them, but they're ethos-based. Okay, they're based on credibility, meaning that we're likely to believe what they have to say. So you need to think about, how can you build your own credibility? Okay, well, in person, it's dressing a certain way, it's presenting yourself in a confident way, but in our writing, we can do it too. Largely has to do with formatting and grammar. Okay, if an essay is formatted correctly, I assume that the ideas are good, even though that may not be the case. Somebody can format their essay perfectly and not know what they're talking about. But it's an issue of presenting it in a credible way. Similar with your grammar. Now, I'm not alone in this. If you read something that is littered with grammar and spelling errors, you're going to be more likely to think the person does not know what they're talking about, even though that very well may not be the case. A lot of smart people have trouble with grammar. But once again, it's a perception issue when we're talking about ethos. So when you're thinking about credibility ethos, how can people seem to be credible? How can you make yourself seem like you know what you're talking about? Okay. Now the next appeal is pathos. Any ideas what this is? Yes, this is emotion. Okay. This is related to the word pathetic, right? So you can think about that. Pathetic is something, strong emotions, typically negative, but it's still related to emotion. And this is when you try to convince somebody to do something or think something based on an emotional response, right? If you've ever seen a Sarah McLachlan video for saving the dogs, with the sad music playing, well, then you know what pathos is all about. Now, there are logical reasons to adopt a shelter dog, right? But those kind of commercials really play on the pathos, the emotion, trying to make you feel pity and sorry for the dog. Same thing with the commercials trying to get you to sponsor a child in a third world country. Okay. Now, that's not to say that these commercials are making bad arguments. It's an issue of they're maybe not relying as much on logic as we would like. It's really heavy based on the emotion. Okay. Now, pathos is something that a little goes a long way. It's totally fine to have a little bit of emotional connection with your reader. But if you use too much pathos at the expense of logic, you're going to feel manipulative to your reader. Okay, people don't like their heartstrings pulled too much. And this is where you also get politicians and other people who use so much emotion that they want you to forget about the logic. Okay, and they can play on pride. They can play on pride, positive emotions, right? Try to get you to feel patriotic to convince you to do something. This can also be negative emotions, fear, disgust, etc. Right? If you've ever seen Inside Out, like my children like to watch all the time, you know what I'm talking about with those. But this is what we mean by pathos. Okay? And then finally, logos is, yes, you guessed it, logic. Okay, this is where you're using reasoning, facts, statistics. Okay, and obviously logos should be a huge part of your essay. In fact, it should be the most important part. But you can't forget the credibility and a little bit of emotion to balance out your really strong logic. Okay, so that's what we want to look for in any good argument. Okay, when we're judging sources, we got to make sure they're using these things well, and if they're not, we want to either avoid it or call it out in our own essay. In our own essays, then we want to make sure we're using these things effectively, because you really need all three in a proper balance to have the strongest possible argument. Logic by itself is not enough, because then the person may not care because there's no pathos, and they may not even trust what you say because you don't have credibility. Okay, but if you have all three in harmony, it's going to be great. Now, there is one other thing that Aristotle referenced and that we're going to talk about now, besides the ethos, pathos, and logos. Okay, and that has to do with audience awareness. Okay, because if you are not approaching an appropriate audience, it doesn't matter how strong your argument is, it's going to fall on deaf ears. Okay, for instance, consider an argument about renewable energy. Okay, and you make a logical argument about how we need to shift away from using coal and oil based on certain statistics about global climate change and global warming. You then put a little bit of emotion in there about the deaths that this has already caused, and then you build your credibility by having a lot of good sources, because the more sources you use, you gain their credibility in your own paper. Right? So it could be a great argument. But what happens when your audience is a coal miner? Somebody whose living is made by mining coal. Well, guess what? They're going to be a hostile audience. It's going to be really hard to convince them to go with your argument. Okay, and that's an audience consideration, because if you were to talk to somebody who is in a completely different field, it would go a lot easier. Okay, so what we have to do is make sure that we're aware of our audience so we can approach them in the most appropriate way. And I like to think of it as a spectrum, like I have here. On one end of the spectrum, you have people who strongly disagree. They are closed-minded. They will never change their mind on this topic. Disagree, this is people who do not agree with your topic. They do not agree with your position, but they're open-minded. Neutral, of course, that means they don't have an opinion on the issue. Agree and strongly agree relates to the other side as well. Now, which of these groups do we want to focus on? Okay. What about agree and strongly agree? No, of course not, right? They already agree with us. Right? That would be preaching to the choir, as the old saying goes. Well, then you might say, well, disagree and strongly disagree. Well, I would agree with you on the disagree for sure. Okay? Because these are people who are not on our side that we can bring over. But strongly disagree. Remember, these are the closed-minded people that are so entrenched in their attitude that they're not going to change. Don't worry about them. Worry about the people who are at least open to a debate, even if it will be difficult to convince them, right? They can still be passionate, but at least they're listening to you. The strongly disagree are the people who they will not change their mind. Okay? And the neutral as well, you want to concern yourself with. Okay? Now, which is more difficult? Well, depends on what the neutral is, right? On one hand, you have people who are indifferent, okay? People who have not made a decision and that don't care. Another word for that is apathetic. And then you also have the people who are undecided. Undecided means that they care about the topic, but they haven't made a choice. This is going to somebody's door, knocking and saying, hey, who are you voting for in the election? And they say, I haven't decided yet. And you say, well, here I'm going to tell you why you should vote for Jones instead of Smith. That is a challenge, but, you know, there's somebody who actually cares. Indifferent would be going up to the door, knocking, and saying, hey, I want you to vote for Jones. And the person says, I don't vote because voting is stupid. Now you have somebody who doesn't even care enough about the topic to have an opinion, doesn't even want to form an opinion. So that's a double challenge. That you have to now tell them why the topic is important and also why they should come to your side, right? At least with the disagree, these people care enough about the topic that they've made a decision. It's bringing them over to your side. So when we make our arguments, we really have to think about our audience. In addition to the ethos, pathos, and logos, think about what are people likely to agree with, right? What are they likely to disagree with? And how can we make the topic seem important to them? If we can do all this, then we're going to have a much stronger argument than if we ignored these argumentative appeals.